P. What truly unsettles an avoidant is not your silence, it's your evolution in full view. Silence, after all, can be interpreted in a dozen different ways. It can be dismissed as anger, processed as temporary distance, or even reframed as something you'll eventually break. An avoidant mind is remarkably skilled at creating narratives that protect it from discomfort. But growth, real, visible, undeniable growth, doesn't offer that same luxury of reinterpretation, because growth is evidence. When you begin to invest in yourself, your emotional regulation, your purpose, your self-respect, you are no longer operating within the old dynamic they understood. You are no longer reacting in predictable ways. You're not reaching out at the same moments, not seeking reassurance in the same tone, not bending yourself to maintain proximity. And this shift does something profound. It disrupts their internal model of you. Psychologically, avoidants rely on distance not just as a behavior, but as a framework. It allows them to feel in control, to engage without fully exposing themselves, to step back the moment vulnerability becomes real. But your growth introduces something they cannot regulate. You are your own independence from their system. You're no longer orbiting their comfort zone. You've created your own center of gravity, and that's where the discomfort begins. Because now, instead of you reflecting their expectations, you reflect their avoidance. You become a mirror, not in the sense of confrontation, but in contrast. Your emotional stability highlights their inconsistency. Your clarity highlights their confusion. Your self-assuredness exposes their underlying fear of intimacy. This isn't something they can argue with or deflect easily, because it's not being imposed on them, it's simply being lived by you. There's a philosophical dimension to this as well. Human beings at a fundamental level measure themselves through relational feedback. We understand who we are partly by how others respond to us. When you were more available, more accommodating, more willing to stay despite uncertainty, you reinforced a certain identity for them, one where their distance was acceptable, manageable, even justified. But when you grow beyond that role, you withdraw that reinforcement. Now they're left without the familiar feedback loop. And that absence isn't quiet, it's loud in a different way. It forces introspection, whether they consciously engage with it or not, because your growth poses an implicit question. Why am I still the same? That question is far more unsettling than silence. Silence can be ignored. Growth demands comparison. It's important to understand that this isn't about triggering insecurity or creating pain for its own sake. This is a byproduct of alignment. When you align with your own values, when you stop negotiating your worth, when you invest in becoming emotionally self-sufficient, you naturally outgrow dynamics that were built on imbalance. And anyone who remains in that old pattern will feel the shift, whether they admit it or not. From a psychological standpoint, this is where cognitive dissonance begins to surface. They may have believed that distance was necessary, that closeness with you would lead to pressure or loss of autonomy. But now, observing you from afar, composed, fulfilled, no longer pursuing, they're confronted with a contradiction. You weren't the source of the discomfort they anticipated. In fact, your absence of neediness, your quiet confidence, suggests the opposite. And that realization doesn't arrive with clarity, it arrives with tension, because it challenges the protective beliefs they've relied on. Your growth, then, is not loud in expression, but it is undeniable in impact. It removes the illusion that things would always remain the same. It breaks the expectation that you would always be there in the same capacity. And perhaps most importantly, it introduces the idea that they may have misjudged you and themselves. That's why this hurts more than silence ever could. Silence leaves space for fantasy. Growth replaces fantasy with reality. And reality is harder to escape. So as you continue to evolve, understand what you're really doing. You're not trying to prove a point. You're not trying to win a psychological game. You're simply stepping into a version of yourself that no longer fits within the limitations of that dynamic. And in doing so, you create a ripple effect that reaches far beyond your own experience. Because the moment you stop shrinking to be understood by someone who avoids understanding, you force a shift that cannot be undone. And that is the moment everything changes. Growth doesn't speak, but it reveals everything. What follows that visible growth is something even more destabilizing for an avoidant dynamic: your emotional detachment. Not silence, not distance as a tactic, but a genuine shift in where your emotional center of gravity sits. Because as long as your emotions are still tethered to them, there is still a thread they can feel, even from afar. And where there is a thread, there is influence. This is where many people misunderstand the difference between silence and detachment. Silence can still be charged. It can still carry expectation, longing, even quiet protest. An avoidant can sense that energy even if nothing is being said, and because they sense it, they remain in some way in control of the emotional frame. They know the connection hasn't truly dissolved, it's just paused. But real detachment is different. It's not performative. It's not waiting to be noticed. It's not hoping to provoke a reaction. It is, quite simply, the absence of emotional dependence, and that absence is what disrupts everything. From a psychological standpoint, avoidant individuals often operate within a push-pull dynamic that allows them to engage without ever fully surrendering control. When closeness increases, they pull away. When distance grows too large, they may re-engage just enough to restore balance on their terms. This rhythm gives them a sense of safety. It allows them to participate in connection without confronting the deeper vulnerability they instinctively resist. But your detachment removes your participation in that rhythm. You are no longer pushing. You are no longer pulling. You are no longer responding in ways that sustain the cycle. And without your engagement, the entire structure collapses. Not dramatically, not all at once, but quietly, unmistakably. Because control in any relational dynamic is not a fixed possession. It's a shared illusion, maintained by mutual investment. The moment one person withdraws that investment not through silence, but through emotional independence, the illusion dissolves. And this is where the discomfort intensifies. Because now, there is nothing to regulate, no reaction to anticipate, no emotional lever to pull. Me no way. Your calm becomes unpredictable, not because it's chaotic, but because it's no longer oriented around them. And that lack of orientation is deeply unsettling for someone who is used to being the reference point of your emotional world. Philosophically, this touches on something fundamental about human relationships. We are most comfortable where we are most familiar. Even unhealthy dynamics can feel stable when they are predictable, but your detachment introduces a new kind of uncertainty, not about whether you care, but about whether you are still available in the way they once understood. And the answer, increasingly, is no. Not because you've become cold or indifferent or closed off, but because your sense of self is no longer contingent on their presence. You're no longer seeking resolution from them. You're no longer defining your worth through their consistency or lack of it. You've stepped out of the emotional negotiation entirely. And that's what shifts the power dynamic, not in a manipulative sense, but in a structural one. Because power, at its core, often resides in who needs the other more. When your need diminishes, not suppressed, not denied, but genuinely resolved within yourself, you become less accessible to the old patterns. And that inaccessibility is not something they can correct through distance or re-engagement. For me, it's not something they can win back through timing or strategy. It simply is. There's also a deeper psychological tension that begins to emerge at this point. When someone who was once emotionally invested becomes detached, it challenges the other person's assumptions about permanence. Avoidants, in particular, often operate with an implicit belief that others will remain available, even if at a distance. That the connection can be revisited when it feels safe enough. That time, space, and silence will preserve the option. But your detachment quietly removes that option. Not through confrontation, not through declaration, but through transformation. You are no longer waiting in the wings of their readiness. You are no longer a constant in the background of their uncertainty. You've moved forward, not away from them, but toward yourself. And that movement cannot be undone by their timing. This is where the impact becomes undeniable. Because it's no longer about what you're doing, it's about what you're no longer available for. The conversations that once looped now end. The emotional openings that once lingered now close naturally. The space they once relied on as a buffer no longer contains you. And in that absence of access, something becomes clear. They are no longer influencing your internal state. That realization carries a weight that silence never could. Silence can be temporary. Silence can be broken. But detachment, once real, is not easily reversed. It reflects a deeper shift, a reorganization of identity, of priorities, of emotional alignment. So when you reach this point, understand what it represents. You haven't just stepped, but you've stepped out. Out of the cycle, out of the ambiguity, out of the quiet dependence that kept the dynamic alive. And in doing so, you've removed the one thing that sustained their sense of control. You. And when someone realizes they no longer have access to your emotional world, they are left with something far more confronting than silence irrelevance. And once that detachment settles in, once you've truly stepped out of the emotional cycle, something else begins to emerge. Something even more disorienting for an avoidant, your visible happiness without them. not performative happiness. Not the kind designed to provoke jealousy or prove a point, but a grounded, quiet sense of fulfillment that doesn't reference them at all. And that distinction matters because avoidants are highly attuned to intention. If your happiness is still in reaction to them, it can be dismissed, minimized, or reinterpreted as temporary. But when it stands on its own, when it exists without any trace of comparison, it becomes much harder to ignore. Because now, your life is no longer a continuation of what you had with them. It's something entirely separate, self-sustaining, complete in its own right. And this is where a deeper psychological tension begins to take hold. Avoidants often maintain distance through a set of internal narratives, beliefs that justify why closeness feels unsafe or unnecessary. They may tell themselves that relationships lead to pressure, that emotional intimacy compromises independence, or that the connection simply wasn't right in a way that absolves them of deeper reflection. These narratives are not random, they are protective. They allow the avoidant to disengage without confronting the underlying discomfort that intimacy brings. But your happiness begins to challenge those narratives in a very direct way. Because if you were the source of pressure, why do you now appear at ease? If the connection was inherently limiting, why do you seem expansive in its absence? If distance was the solution, why does your life look more whole, not less, without them in it? These are not questions you ask them. These are questions your life answers on its own. And that's what makes it so impactful. There is no argument to defend against, no accusation to deflect, just a quiet contradiction between what they believed and what they now observe. And that contradiction creates cognitive dissonance, the kind that doesn't resolve easily. From a philosophical standpoint, this touches on the idea that we construct meaning through comparison. We define our choices by how they reflect back on us. When someone we've distanced from appears diminished, it reinforces the belief that the distance was justified. But when that same person appears to thrive, it destabilizes that belief. Because now, the outcome doesn't match the expectation. Your happiness becomes a form of evidence not directed at them, not even concerned with them, but existing in a way that forces reevaluation. And reevaluation is uncomfortable, especially when it suggests that the narrative you relied on may have been incomplete. There's also an element of loss that begins to surface here, though it may not be immediately recognized as such. Not just the loss of you as a person, but the loss of a particular version of reality, one where they could step back without consequence, where the connection remained suspended, where your presence was consistent regardless of their distance. Your happiness disrupts that continuity because it signals movement. It shows that time didn't just pass, it transformed you. And transformation introduces finality, not in a dramatic sense, but in a quiet, undeniable way. The version of you they once knew is no longer accessible in the same form. And more importantly, the version of the relationship they held on to no longer exists in your world. That realization carries a subtle weight. It's not loud, it's not immediate, but it lingers. Because it introduces a possibility they may not have fully considered, that in choosing distance, they didn't just preserve space. They allowed something meaningful to evolve beyond their reach. And again, this is not about causing regret. It's about understanding impact. Because when your happiness is genuine, it does something silence never could. It removes ambiguity. There's no need to wonder how you feel, no room to assume you're waiting, no indication that the door remains open in the same way. Your life communicates that you've moved forward, not as a reaction, but as a direction. And direction is powerful. It tells a story of agency, of choice, of self-definition that no longer depends on unresolved dynamics. And for someone who once relied on distance to maintain a sense of control, witnessing that level of autonomy can be deeply disorienting. Because now, they are no longer part of the equation that defines your well-being. And that absence isn't something they can reframe. It's something they have to face. So when you think about what truly affects an avoidant, understand this. It's not your silence that echoes at your fulfillment. It's the realization that you didn't just survive the distance, you transcended it. That your life didn't pause in their absence. It expanded beyond it. And in that expansion, something becomes undeniably clear. You were never waiting to be chosen, you were always becoming someone who could choose. And once that becomes visible, it leaves behind a truth that cannot be undone. Your happiness was never dependent on them, it was only delayed by them. And once your growth is evident, your detachment is real, and your happiness stands independently. There is one final shift that brings everything into sharp focus: your boundaries. Not as a reaction, not as a defense mechanism, but as a clear and deliberate expression of what you will and will not participate in moving forward. Because silence can be misread, growth can be observed from a distance. Even detachment can be rationalized as temporary. But boundaries, especially when they are consistent, leave very little room for interpretation. They clarify. And clarity is often what an avoidant dynamic has been structured to avoid. Up until this point, much of the interaction may have existed in ambiguity, mixed signals, undefined expectations, emotional availability that fluctuates just enough to keep the connection alive without fully stabilizing it. This ambiguity benefits avoidance. It allows space to retreat without consequence, to re-engage without accountability, to remain undefined in a way that protects against vulnerability. But boundaries remove that ambiguity entirely. They introduce definition where there was once uncertainty. They establish limits where there was once flexibility. And most importantly, they are upheld not through force, but through consistency. You are no longer negotiating your needs in real time. You have already decided what aligns with you, and you act accordingly. Psychologically, this creates a kind of pressure that silence never could. Not external pressure, not confrontation, but structural pressure. The dynamic itself changes. The space that once accommodated avoidance no longer does. And this forces a kind of awareness that cannot be bypassed. Because now the interaction has terms, not demands, not ultimatums, but standards. And standards require response. They require a choice to meet them or to disengage. What they don't allow is the passive continuation of a pattern that no longer fits. For someone accustomed to distance as a form of control, this shift can feel particularly confronting. Pro's control in this context was never about dominance, it was about flexibility. The ability to move in and out without fully committing, to shape the interaction without fully defining it. But boundaries limit that flexibility. They establish a framework that exists independently of the other person's comfort. And that independence is what changes everything. From a philosophical perspective, boundaries are an expression of self-definition. They are not about restricting others, they are about revealing who you are in relation to what you allow. When you set a boundary, you are not trying to control someone else's behavior. You are clarifying your own participation. I will not engage in this. I will not remain in that. I will not return to what no longer aligns. These are not statements directed outward, they are commitments held inward. And because they are internal, they do not require validation to remain intact. This is where accountability enters the picture. Not because you are forcing it, but because the absence of ambiguity naturally reveals it. When the dynamic is no longer blurred, behavior becomes easier to see for what it is. Inconsistency is no longer confusing, it is simply misalignment. Distance is no longer mysterious, it is a choice with consequences. Me no. And those consequences are not imposed, they are inherent in your withdrawal from what doesn't meet your standard. This is often the point where something shifts for the avoidant, even if it isn't expressed directly. Because for the first time, the connection is not being sustained by your tolerance of uncertainty. It is being defined by your refusal to engage in it. And that refusal is not loud. It doesn't need to be. It's present in what you no longer accept, in what you no longer revisit, in what you no longer explain. There is a quiet finality